I just asked the president, it's this massive complex that he built, jail complex. I said, can you build some more of them, please?
The Trump administration has sent hundreds to prison in El Salvador, including Kilmar Obrego Garcia, who it later admitted never should have been deported in the first place. Alongside the massive problems with process, transparency, and defying of courts, there is a glaring question. What might people sent to El Salvador's prisons be experiencing right now? How can groups raise alarms about human rights violations while El Salvador's president openly mocks concerns about torture and posts about the sipping of margaritas in tropical paradise? How do we account for that contrast? To understand, we need to unlock the secrets. What is the prison system like? And what lesson does this situation hold for those fearing authoritarianism in the United States? El Salvador's condemned are sent to brutal mega prisons with straightforward sounding names like Terrorism Confinement Center or gentle names like La Esperanza, the Hope. But El Salvador is secretive and selective about the images and information that leave these facilities. Therefore, I've referred to the work of nonprofits, media coverage, and other governments to piece together an image for you, and I'll flag sources that need to be taken with a grain of salt. El Salvadoran prisons fall into two categories: the normal prisons, which are overcrowded, and the mega prison, CECOT, best described as extremely rough. The prison system in El Salvador is run under the Ministerio de Justicia y Seguridad Pública, the Ministry of Justice and Public Security. About 2% of El Salvadoran adults are incarcerated. According to the World Prison Brief, there are approximately 110,000 inmates throughout the country's 24 prisons. The incarceration rate is between 1,000 and 1,600 in prison for every 100,000 in the population. That's the highest in the world, roughly double Cuba's incarceration rate, perhaps triple the US. And a large portion of those prisoners recently entered this system in a massive wave that we're going to get to. Like other countries in Latin America, El Salvador's legal system finds its roots in Spanish colonialism. The Federation of Central American States gained independence from Spain in the 1820s, and El Salvador set out as an independent country in the 1840s. After El Salvador's civil war between 1980 and 1992, a new penal code was created in 1997. Since then, it's received many updates. You may find yourself imprisoned in El Salvador for a felony, delito, or misdemeanor, falta. Major felonies, delitos graves, include homicide, kidnapping, armed robbery, and sexual crimes, for which sentences exceed 3 years and last up to 75. But as we'll see, in recent times, life in prison has become an expected punishment for suspected gang members. Prior to the 2022 crackdown on gangs by President Nayib Bukele, La Esperanza, also known as Mariona, was the largest prison in El Salvador. Constructed in 1972 with a capacity of 10,000, it was holding 33,000. In 2024, journalists were escorted inside La Esperanza by authorities to see the so-called Zero Leisure Plan, Plan Cero Ocio, of 2,000 low-priority inmates being rehabilitated through labor, on garments, mechanics, even given the chance for art and music. Authorities claim eligible participants were able to work to reduce their sentence. At another facility in Santa Ana, prisoners participated in agricultural work. Now, is this legitimate effort at reducing recidivism? Or is it just public relations attached to exploitative prison labor? We simply don't have enough transparency to know. Images and information that come out about these prisons are carefully curated. And as of now, the 2,000 claimed to be participating in such rehabilitation programs constitute a small minority of El Salvador's incarcerated population. The director of the Americas Division of Human Rights Watch stated that prisons like La Esperanza and Santa Ana include, quote, cases of torture, ill treatment, incommunicado detention, severe violations of due process, and inhumane conditions, such as lack of access to adequate healthcare and food. Media were not able to access cells on their tour of La Esperanza. Designed for 50 inmates each, its likely cells are actually crowded with closer to 300 individuals at a time. But regular criminal law and so-called normal prisons are not what have made El Salvador a darling of the MAGA movement. And flawed as those previously mentioned facilities might have been, they were not where people like Obrego Garcia were initially sent from the United States after improper extraction. To see how El Salvador's prisons and President Bukele became the center of international attention, we need to talk about 2022's March Massacre. When El Salvador's long civil war ended in 1992, the violence did not. Gang members deported from the United States made their way back home, growing the domestic ranks of MS-13 and Barrio 18. By the 2010s, the homicide rate in El Salvador was the highest in the Western Hemisphere. The former mayor of San Salvador, Nayib Bukele, won El Salvador's 2019 presidential election as an outsider, offering a break from the two-party establishment that had failed to stop the gangs. Interestingly, subsequent investigations suggested that Bukele had actually paid gangs during the 2015 mayoral election, but let's be real, with gangs as powerful, if not more powerful than the government itself, things get a little complicated, just my opinion, but it does show this early interdependency between Bukele and the gangs. Nonetheless, in 2019, presidential candidate Bukele promised to reduce violent crime and won over 50% of the vote. Once in office, the murder rate did indeed drop, as Bukele seemed to be negotiating behind the scenes to cut deals with the gangs, as his predecessors had attempted. But it all fell apart a couple years into Bukele's first term, when violence erupted to a new high. Over a single weekend in March 22, 87 people were murdered by gangs. That very Sunday, the Asamblea Legislativa, the Legislative Assembly, approved a so-called régimen de excepción, a state of exception, to confront the situation. It was martial law. With constitutional rights suspended for 30 days, the military and police were free to make sweeping arrests without warrants or due process. And that's important because Article 12 of El Salvador's constitution states, quote, "Every person accused of an offense shall be presumed innocent, while his guilt is not proven in conformity with the law and in public trial." During the state of emergency, the opposite was true. Guilt was presumed and trials were closed. In the crackdown that followed, tens of thousands were arrested, over 20,000 in the first months. After years and over 30 renewals of the so-called state of exception, that total rose to 85,000. The laws, the judiciary, and El Salvador's constitution itself were modified to make the executive's efforts easier. As Bukele said in his February 2024 speech to CPAC,
"We did the unthinkable to cleanse our society. We arrested the terrorists, but we have to remove corrupt judges and corrupt attorneys and prosecutors."
After taking office, Bukele and his allies in the Legislative Assembly rebuilt the judiciary to their liking, amended the constitution to make opposition more difficult during legislative debate, and even legalized group trials of up to 900 people at a time. That's if the accused get a trial at all. But let's be clear, Bukele's security developments were absolutely effective in dropping the murder rate from one of the highest in the Western Hemisphere to one of the lowest. Public life returned to streets once controlled block by rebel gangs, and polling showed 90% of El Salvador's public approved. While other leaders in surrounding countries scrambled to emulate Bukele's crackdown, the people of El Salvador re-elected him in 2024 with an astonishing 83% of the vote. By the way, the constitution had to be amended just to allow him to run again. But Bukele, who once referred to himself as the world's coolest dictator, has not been immune from criticism. First and foremost, people complained innocents were wrongfully arrested during the crackdown. Because of the suspension of due process, there was no way to adjudicate guilt or innocence of the accused. Families and attorneys of many incarcerated people insisted they were being arbitrarily detained, and making matters worse, there was often no way to know where individuals were sent after arrest or how long they would be gone. And authorities never actually denied that innocent people were wrongly arrested. Instead, they framed such incidents as collateral damage of a larger mission. By late 2024, they'd released 7,000 to 8,000 innocent people who had been caught up in the crackdown. But rights groups claim there are many more who have been wrongly imprisoned, literally guilty by unlawful association. Second, criticism was raised about the conditions in the prison to which alleged gang members were sent. Stories emerged of disease, torture, and hundreds of cases of mysterious deaths. Again, the government seemed to relish these accusations. In fact, Justice Minister Gustavo Villatoro quipped in 2023 that the only way out of El Salvadoran prison is a coffin. A report from Cristosal, a human rights organization in El Salvador, relied on testimony from hundreds of innocent people who were released by the government in the first year of the state of exception to claim, quote, systematic human rights violations. They documented claims of electroshocks, extrajudicial executions, violent and suspicious deaths. El País reporter Brian Avelar summarized it this way, quote, dozens of inmates died as a result of torture, beatings, mechanical suffocation via strangulation, or wounds, or were left to die because of lack of medical attention. Cristosal said that they were in some cases, quote, able to verify that their bodies presented signs of violence, like pummeling, choking, and cuts. And of course, there were concerns about overcrowding. El Salvador's existing prisons were already busy before the 2022 crackdown. As more and more individuals were incarcerated for undisclosed amounts of time, conditions became unsustainably overcrowded. Looking to relieve other prisons while asserting their ever-expanding authority, Bukele and his government unveiled a new project, a massive, mysterious installation. This is the place you've seen on the news, the biggest piece of the puzzle to understanding the recent infamy for El Salvador's prison system. We need to talk about CECOT. In 2023, President Bukele took to social media to unveil his magnum opus, awaited by administrators and guards in a rural mountainous area southeast of San Salvador. All the choreography and cameras were there to show off the Terrorism Confinement Center, CECOT. The center is said to sprawl 57 acres, with police and soldiers surrounding, checkpoints blocking roads, and a strict no visitors policy, be they family, attorneys, or rights groups. Originally described as a space for 20,000, the government eventually raised the stated capacity to 40,000. Walls are reinforced concrete, outside are guard towers and electrified fencing. But CECOT isn't a single building, rather it's a series of 8 buildings. Within each are about 30 cells, totaling 256 across the facility. I've seen claims that each cell can hold between 65 and 156 inmates, but without transparent access, it's kind of hard to know. There are currently between 14 and 18,000 alleged gang members imprisoned here. Government videos and curated media on YouTube show cell after cell of tattoo-adorned, stone-faced inmates. The spectacle has actually generated hundreds of millions of views. Within each CECOT cell are metal bunks without mattresses, a toilet in the corner, a bathing basin, and a barrel of drinking water. Inmates are never allowed outdoors and are given roughly half an hour each day outside the cell for guided exercise. The other 23.5 hours are spent inside the cell, where the lights never go out. Because access is so guarded, media visits limited and staged, we have very little information about the true conditions inside the mega prison. Critically, those who come here are never expected to leave. Incarceration in CECOT is considered permanent. During their tour, France 24 quoted the prison director as saying the inmates are, quote, psychopaths who will be difficult to rehabilitate. That's why they are here in a maximum security prison that they will never leave. This is backed up by higher ranking officials like Bukele's security minister, who we met earlier. He told the BBC, quote, "We have made a commitment to the people of El Salvador that they will never be released to the communities." In fact, the only documented case I could find of someone leaving CECOT is the man we started with, the man the US admitted to wrongly deporting, Abrego Garcia. Human Rights Watch claimed they were, quote, not aware of any detainees who have been released from that prison. But those words were written prior to the April 2025 visit to El Salvador of Senator Chris Van Hollen. That's when the senator was able to press for a visit with Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Originally sent to the Terrorism Confinement Center, Garcia told Senator Van Hollen that he was in CECOT before being transferred out to a prison in Santa Ana the week before their meeting. Therefore, Abrego Garcia is the only prisoner we know of to enter and leave CECOT.
So what do we take away from all this? It's easy to just say, okay, El Salvador's is a macabre foreign prison system, the American administration sending people there, paying to send people there for potential life imprisonment without formal charges. It's messed up, but that's all been said. Instead, I want to bring your attention to the word terrorist and then the word time. First, terrorist. These activities, from Bukele's initial crackdown to American involvement today, it's all been framed through the lens of terrorism. As President Bukele said, they began to change and transform until
they became the unscrupulous terrorists that we know today.
The CECOT mega prison is named Center for Confinement of Terrorists, and when asked if he would send the mistakenly deported Abrego Garcia back to the USA, Bukele said, "How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States. Now listen, you're not going to get much pushback from me on labeling MS-13 Barrio 18 Venezuela's Tren de Aragua as terrorists. Circumstances were murky, but the March 22 gang murder spree in El Salvador that preceded Bukele's state of exception might have been due to a breakdown in a deal with the government. It might have been politically motivated to show the government that the gangs were really in charge. That's violence with a political agenda. Therefore, labeling these folks as terrorists and creating a window for emergency powers, in my opinion, not crazy. El Salvador's legislature even voted for it. Democratic societies invest their chief executives with emergency powers. Even our greatest, most celebrated leaders have done things in emergencies that would have been alarming outside of them. The hope, the trust we carry is that our elected leaders will be virtuous and use emergency powers only in emergencies, and then only for the duration of the emergency. Legend has it that the Roman man-made dictator Cincinnatus led the Romans to victory. Then he gave up his dictatorial power, returned to his farm. In 1794, President Washington, Washington Monument guy, enforced a whiskey tax by means of military force against American citizens. Then he walked away from power, establishing our two-term presidential tradition. Of all the presidents, we have a few represented here on the mall: Washington, Lincoln. If you extend that to the White House, Jackson, and Lafayette Park, they're all the presidents that established that, in time-limited emergencies, there are extra powers to be wielded. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln prevented imprisoned people from knowing the charges against them and having judicial review of that imprisonment, aka he suspended habeas corpus. The mainstream view is that Abraham Lincoln was nonetheless virtuous. His use of power was temporary in wartime. That's why we celebrate him on the National Mall. We see these men and we tell the story that they broke standards to protect liberty in a time-limited emergency. Extraordinary power, time-limited emergency. Recent history does not bode well for this concept. During the War on Terror, the Bush administration held suspected terrorists in an extraterritorial facility, Guantanamo, systematically denying habeas corpus and due process. But would this emergency ever end? When might terror be defeated? If the government could imprison foreign-born Arabs without due process, then one day they could do it to anyone. Just label someone a terrorist and get around the courts with their pesky prosecutors and defense attorneys. The objections weren't about defending terrorists, they were about upholding the principle that literally anyone and everyone has a right to due process. Even the perpetrators of World War II's darkest crimes against humanity had their day in the International Court at Nuremberg. There must be no exceptions lest we become what we condemn. And here we are, a couple decades into the War on Terror, and once again our administration is sending people to extraterritorial detention without habeas corpus, even defying courts to make it happen, even when the Supreme Court says that the administration must, and the president says he could. Nonetheless, in this case, raw power prevails over procedure. And those sent away are no longer those captured in a faraway land, but those who lived close to home, at home. And we hear from the president that American citizens, homegrowns, are next. And we hear from the Secretary of State that El Salvador is not enough. We need more people going to more countries. After all, it's an emergency. Time-limited one? No, just an emergency. One among many, like the trade emergency and the energy emergency. And have you even heard of this one, the International Criminal Court emergency? And this is the lesson when we must pay attention. When the emergency becomes plural and permanent. Bukele's original state of exception emergency was declared for a month. It's been renewed over 30 times, time limited to boundless. And in the US, there wasn't even an emergency vote. For all we know, we've entered a permanent American state of exception for which rules, rulings, and rights need not apply. Our next move might be another slip down the slope. Again, we look at El Salvador's Bukele because his admirers certainly are. I already played a snippet of his 2024 Conservative Political Action Committee speech Trump would later go on to give the keynote address. Here's the full line that got Bukele a standing ovation.
We did the unthinkable to cleanse our society. We arrested the terrorists, but we have to remove corrupt judges and corrupt attorneys and prosecutors. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Corrupt judges, corrupt attorneys, and prosecutors. For anyone emulating Bukele, his prison system, his power, the judicial branch and its apparatus would be the next obstacle. President Andrew Jackson defied a Supreme Court ruling in 1832. He is often misquoted as saying, Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. What he actually did was declare that the Supreme Court decision was stillborn. The spirit of the quotes is the same. Jackson was saying that the judicial branch doesn't have the raw necessary power to stop the executive. And he was right, but the judiciary does have the power to question the endless emergency, to demand due process, to call for accountability. In short, it can question the narrative of exceptions due to terror. But this challenge can nearly exclusively be conducted in words, in orders and papers for posterity. Judges are likely to be ignored. And as Bukele said, other options exist. The permanent terror emergency, the single man to judge rather than judges. The slope descends in front of us. Believe it or not, we take the next step together. Heads held high, happy warriors. Eyes open. Later, y'all.